We get a lot of questions about roasting decaf because roasting decaf is exceptionally challenging. And whether it's your regular thing that you roast decaf for yourself or occasionally for friends or guests you do it, you will find it is not easy. One of the main reasons why is it's a different color. And different types of decafs, different processes are different colors. And when you try to factor that in and visually judge your roast development, it can get very confusing. So I've made some videos here and some images to try to document color difference between a regular coffee, non-decaf coffee, and a decaf coffee side by side through the roast process. And these are time-lapse videos made in a convective toaster oven. And I use this because the coffee doesn't move, so it's very easy to see the process as it elapses. This is not a great way to roast coffee because it doesn't agitate the coffee and sort of evenly heat it. And you'll see that in the roast, but that's not really the point here. So we're going to look at a couple of these time-lapse videos that I've made. This is the first one. And some still images and try to document like what are these differences and how to factor those in visually and other cues that you may have for determining the degree of roast as you see it change through the roast process with decaf coffee. So the first thing to note here is that these are two Sumatra coffees. On the right is a Sumatra. Let me switch over to the other video, a slightly different angle. And on the right is a washed Sumatra coffee. Washed Sumatra is not the usual. Usually your Sumatras are wet hulled, and that's a different thing, and it looks different roasting. And one thing you'll see here is the way that the Sumatra has this sort of white stripe of chaff, silver skin. The washed coffees will have that more, and you're going to see the exterior silver skin clinging to this coffee as it roasts. On the decaf side, this is a Swiss water processed decaf coffee that we sent to them. And something to note is that in the creases of the coffee here, there is no silver skin or it's been stained. And on the exterior of this coffee, right now it looks sort of variegated in color, but it actually has no chaff. And I mention that because as it roasts, especially at this stage right here, let's pause it, that really does account for some of the color difference visually when you look at it. And as you go along, let's progress here a little more. That's part of the difference with decaf, that besides just the base color, we may not be taking account of. So this is a roast where I go all the way through to second crack. And you can see just here, let's just pause. You would look at these two side by side, and if you didn't know this was a decaf, you would say this was a completely different roast than this over here, than the wet processed non-decaf coffee. And that's what's so confusing. If you're disoriented in your roast process and you walk over and you didn't hear first crack and you're not quite sure where you're at, it's very hard to judge a decaf. And you may end up stopping the roast far sooner than you really want to. You may think it's done when it's not done. So let's go back and look at this more carefully. And this is the fun part. And I'll tell you what is amazing in these videos that I made is I discovered something new that I didn't know and had never seen before. And in fact, I'm not sure anyone else knows it either. I'm going to contact Swiss Water and tell them. But watch the early part of the roast from here, green, to the early yellowing. You're going to see something. I'm going to highlight it right here. Notice that the bean expansion of the non-decaf coffee is far greater in this early yellowing stage than the decaf. So this may or may not have a bearing on the roast. All coffee expands as it roasts. But something interesting about that is it just hints at how much the decaf coffee has been changed by what it's been through in the decaffeination process. So we see the color when we get our bag of decaf coffee and we notice that it's a different color. But that's only really part of a hint at what's the changes that's gone on. Right here, we're at first crack, where I indicate with the pen. It's the very first part of first crack. And you can see how differently you would judge these two roasts if you were just glancing at them and you didn't know which was decaf and which wasn't. There you can see coffee. This one right over here is really interesting to watch it expand and move as it hits first crack and almost explodes like popcorn. In any case, decaf coffee, in the case of Swiss water, which is a non-chemical decaf, removes caffeine by extracting, essentially with steam and heat, a lot of the material from the coffee, including caffeine. It takes that sort of soup and uses filtration to remove the caffeine, then reintroduces that to the sort of empty vessel of the green coffee, which are kind of like a sponge that reabsorbs all that material, that sort of good qualities, sans the caffeine, without caffeine. And then they in mechanical drying machines, they re-dry it. So the coffee has been through a lot. It may have the same moisture percentage as a non-decaf coffee at that point, but it's been through a whole kind of traumatic process. And the truth is that decaf coffee is degraded coffee. It has been compromised in a way using all of these things, and you wouldn't do this to a coffee for any other purpose except to remove caffeine. You wouldn't want this to happen to your non-decaf coffee. So what's occurred in the last 5 years in particular, 5 to 8 years, is that the decaffeination process has gotten much better. And we send only our own coffee up to decaffeinate. So we start with a much higher quality green bean that goes into the system. And they've gotten really good at profiling the different origins in order to get the best results, flavor results. And they're phenomenal. Some of the things we've received lately are just super phenomenal coffees. Nonetheless, they're trying to do this against the reality that the coffee's been through trauma. And change in color is part of that. Other aspects of it are the kind of nature of the roasted color. Now let's look here, and I'll show a still image too, of the kind of like how we would describe the color difference between a brown decaf at this stage, which is through first crack, and a non-decaf coffee. And what you see here is a greater degree of yellows and reds and this sort of brown, whereas here we have quite a dark matte surface appearance and a different color hue that we judge quite differently than the non-decaf. The matte surface appearance is sort of like light absorbing. It's non-reflectant, and that kind of changes our color perception as well. So you can see all browns are not the same by any means. And in these images too, what you see is surface oils developing on the decaf coffee. For example, here. Let's look at those in the still images. And in these images right here, you can actually see it come to the surface. Now, the reason for that is hinting at the fact that decaf has been sort of structurally compromised. Coffee is made up of cellulose to a large degree in the structure of it. Cellulose is like plant material, wood, And it forms a kind of a matrix, a cell matrix, in which those oils that develop during roasting would, in a light roast or in a non-decaf coffee, be trapped in the cell pocket and stay there. And in a coffee that's been sort of roasted dark or compromised by decaf, they travel to the surface. So, as most of you know, oils on the coffee during the roast is not super desirable. A lot of coffee will develop those oils later as it rests, and the gases drive those oils out of the coffee to the surface, but you don't really want to see that during roasting. Nonetheless, this is extremely dark roasting here. We'll go back again to see at this point right here when I put the pen in, I'm indicating the start of first crack. So here we're going through the changes, color changes, and bean expansion. When you see the pen come in again, right here, I'm at second crack. So in pointing out these visual differences between decaf and regular, I hope I'm underscoring how much you need to visually adjust your senses when you're roasting decaf coffee in order to make a good call on what to do and where to stop. But in terms of general roast advice, I realize I'm not giving much here. So I will say this structural compromise that results in these oils migrating to the surface of a decaf coffee means that you need to treat it more gently with the heat in a roaster. So initially, you don't want to push too much heat at your coffee, and as you finish your roast, you want to be gentle with it. And another way to look at this is, as you can see here, your regular coffee has actually had these sort of explosive discs come off of it, which is due to the degassing of a coffee as it hits second crack, where it's fractured, that cellulose matrix is fractured, and those gases form such pressure that they actually blow apart these little discs from the surface of the coffee. And yet you don't see it in the decaf because the already structurally compromised cellulose matrix has simply allowed the oils to escape. So another interesting footnote between decaf and regular coffees.